Yes, 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 yes. Så där ja, då ska vi se. Nu börjar folk dyka in här. Vi hoppar direkt in för det är faktiskt dags för räntebeskedet här alldeles strax. Så jag önskar er alla välkomna som kommit in hittills till veckans webinar helt enkelt. Vi kommer kolla på Fed Powell live vid 20:30. Vi kommer börja nu kolla på räntebeskedet 20:00. Efter det så kör vi lite teknisk analys mellan 20:00 till 20:30. Och sedan så kommer jag streama Powells tal från 20:30 tills han är klar. Det kan ta allt runt 45 minuter ungefär brukar det ta helt enkelt. Så vi inväntar räntebeskedet här nu alldeles strax om 4 minuter. Vi har 3 minuter och 20 sekunder kvar till räntebeskedet. Och just nu marknaden förväntar sig en höjning på 0,25% helt enkelt. Så 0,25% är förmodligen det vi får. Och det kommer bli väldigt volatilt i våra index och marknader. Men det brukar ta fart på riktigt när väl Powell drar igång med sitt tal. Så vi har en kväll full av volatilitet framför oss. För tillfället så kan vi se att marknaderna är nere en hel del. Nasdaq just nu, vi ska säga, vi har återhämtat oss lite från dagens bottnar, det har vi gjort. Men fortfarande nere 1%, S&P är nere 0,5%. Så inom en 2,5 minut så kommer vi se en väldigt stor rörelse här strax. Så vi inväntar någonting intressant här nu helt enkelt. Så vi får se vad som händer när väl räntebeskedet kommer in. Spontant så känns det ganska 50-50. Jag tror att vi kommer kanske flyga rakt uppåt för sen gå rakt ner igen. Eller tvärtom att vi tar låsen här och sen går rakt upp igen. Det kommer bli väldigt volatilt. Ingenting som jag kommer trada här direkt. Utan kommer vara svårt att få någonting större säkert här när det väl drar igång. Så vi får helt enkelt bara se hur det fortsätter och vad Powell har att säga sen. Någonting som jag har kollat mycket på i till exempel Nasdaq, det är just att vi ska komma ner till 20 i mig och stänga där gapet här vid 15,360 ungefär. Så det är möjligtvis att den pushar ner dit och stänger gapet här. Stänger hela likviditetsgapet ner till 15,350 ungefär. Det är en intressant nivå för stöd. Skulle det vara så att vi stänger under 20 mig idag, hacka ljudet. För då kan jag testa fixa det. Vi ska se om ljudet hackar. Hacka ljudet för alla, för då kan jag se om jag kan starta om ljudet bara. Helt enkelt. Om det är fler ljudet hackar för. Okej, ljud är bra. Då är det hans högtalare som helt enkelt behöver en tuning. Ja, men det är bra. Det var tack folket. Då vet vi. 40 sekunder till räntebesked. Efter det så ser vi det tekniska, vad som händer. Som sagt, mycket volla förväntas här nu. Vi ska se om 30 sekunder ungefär. Vi ska se. Spännande. Men som sagt, allting lutar att det kommer vara plus 0,25% i ökning eller ökning på 0,25%. Allting över det hade varit en rejäl chock. Men oftast så är det inte några chockar. Det som marknaden prisar in när det kommer till räntehöjningar och sänkningar är i princip allt, det stämmer alltid i princip. Så det hade varit en riktig chock om den stod 5,5 här. En riktig chock. Så vi ska se här. Vad är det vi får? 5,5. Så enligt förväntan dyker det in. Och den första reaktionen är lite Darth Maul Candle. Vi wickar lite åt båda hållen. Mycket möjligt att vi går upp och testar 500 här och sedan kanske får det lite tufft igen. Vi ska se. Mycket möjligt att vi går upp och testar de här lite tidigare topparna från en dag och sedan går ner igen. Det är inte omöjligt om vi nu trycker på uppåt. Men ja, det kom in enligt förväntan, så det är inga jättekonstigheter. Det ändrar inte någonting. Synen på marknaden överhuvudtaget. Det är ingenting nytt där helt enkelt. Men jag tänker att vi börjar direkt att kolla på lite aktier. Som sagt, enligt förväntan här, så inget jätteintressant att hålla koll på. Speciellt intressant det blir när då Powell drar igång 2030. Men fram till det, låt oss ta lite teknisk analys. Nasdaq pratade vi om lite här precis. Så vi kör 30 minuter TA nu inför Powell. Så Nasdaq, jag hade haft koll här nere ifall vi går ner och testar vid 15.350. Här finns väldigt bra stöd runt den här nivån, kanske ända ner till 300. Skulle vi stänga under det, ja då kommer vi nu börja falla hårdare ner mot 15.100. Så väldigt intressanta nivåer här vid 300 nivån. För stöd, håller inte det, ja men då kommer vi nu se lite större fall i Nasdaq nu de kommande dagarna. OMX, ganska intressant idag. Vi fick en ganska tydlig sell-off i OMX. Vi sålde av ganska hårt ett tag. Vi återhämtade oss lite grann från de lägsta nivåerna. Nere vid 2220. Så en hyfsad återhämtning från lowsen. Men spontant, det här är ingenting som ser positivt ut i OMX. Det här ser ut som en graf som vill bryta neråt. Jag ska ta bort lite linjer. Jag kan ta bort allting bara för att göra det lite tydligare. Det här ser ut som en graf just nu för tillfället som vill potentiellt bryta neråt. Vi ser här att vi gör lägre toppar hela tiden här just nu. Vi börjar bli lite tight här inne. Och bra stöd här nere vid den här nivån. Möjligtvis att vi ska ner och testa här igen. Skulle vi bryta den här trendlinjen i OMX, då ska man hålla koll på att vi nu ska upp och testa 22,90 igen, skulle jag tro. Så kan vi bryta den här trendlinjen och stänga ovanför daily, ja men då går vi nu upp och testar 22,90 nivån. Här nere är vi runt 22, ja men 2200 till upp till 2210. Finns också en hel del stöd. Skulle den här brytas, då ska vi minst ner till 21,85 med ganska stor sannolikhet. Det finns även sannolikhet att det finns en bra chans att det blir ända ner till 21,50 för det är ett tydligt stöd som bryter neråt. Så det är lite intressanta nivåer att hålla utkik på i OMX här nu de kommande dagarna. Om vi ser lite stark volatilitet nu kring alla Q2-rapporter och när Powell drar igång. Så lite intressanta nivåer att hålla utkik på lite större vy på både Nasdaq och OMX. Så lite index, jag tänker att vi då hoppar in och kollar på lite av era önskemål i aktieväg. Så jag tänker att vi börjar med det. Vi kan börja kolla på Hexagon. Låt oss kika på Hexagon. Det var ett mycket snack där sen Viceroy gick ut och attackerade Hexagon lite. Vi hade även rapport i Hexagon idag. Och vi ser att Hexagon stänger väldigt bearish. Mycket bearish. Stänger i princip på dagslägsta. Och ja, men det här ser bearish ut. Det ser ut som Hexagon vill fortsätta neråt mot i alla fall 100 nivån. 100 nivån är väldigt, väldigt bra stöd. Vi har tidigare nivåer här från 2020. Vi har här från 2022 i oktober. Och vi kommer ner här nu. Finns väldigt, väldigt bra stöd här vid 100 i hexagon. Så det finns en bra chans att vi kommer ner hit. Och sen får man se om man kan få någon bekräftelse. Något positivt mönster i candlesticksen eller någonting. Så 100 nivån i hexagon. Mycket, mycket intressant att hålla utkik på. Den tycker jag är absolut intressant. Det är nog någonting jag själv kommer att hålla koll på också. För det kan absolut bli en ganska bra stöd där det kan studsa lite i hexagon. Så 100 nivån hade jag haft lite utkik på för lite long trades. Vilka MA är bäst för stöd? Det är lite olika faktiskt från aktie till aktie, men basen som man brukar ha, 20 EMA gillar jag att ha, 50 EMA gillar jag väldigt mycket. Jag bara skriver upp de här så kan man print screen om man är intresserad. Det här är de jag kör. Detta är de moving average jag använder. De starkaste vad jag, min erfarenhet, brukar vara 50 och 200. De brukar vara de starkaste stödnivåerna. 20 EMA brukar fungera väldigt, väldigt bra kortsiktigt också. Men vid lite större dippar, 50 EMA och 200 EMA brukar vara de som är mest intressanta att hålla lite extra utkik på. Låt oss kolla på Embracer. Jag ser det flera som skrivit Embracer. Och Embracer är ju väldigt, väldigt intressant här. Tidigare ser det bullish ut. Och det ser ut som att vi ska börja jobbas uppåt mot det här gapet, jobbas uppåt i den här kanalen på medellång sikt de kommande månaderna. Så väldigt, väldigt intressant här nu. Vi stänger även på ny dagshögsta i Embracer idag. Så det mesta ser positivt ut. Behöver bara lite mer bekräftelse, så ser det väldigt, väldigt starkt ut tycker jag. Så Embracer, vet att det kommit in en del insynsköp idag också. Så jag tycker mycket ser bullish ut i Embracer, både tekniskt och liknande. Det kan bli en liten rejection här och vi går ner till 27-28 igen. Men overall tycker det ser ganska bra ut i Embracer. Låt oss kika på Humble Group. Humble, de kommer också in med rapport nu här om dagen som folk verkade ha uppskattat. Aktien är väldigt långt ner från sina toppar 2021 där den var på 33. Men vi har fortfarande en ganska intakt downtrend. Moving average är neråt. Vi har lägre toppar hela tiden. Kan vi ha någon fin channel? Svår att göra en jätteexakt channel, men någonting i den här stilen. Någonting i den stilen ser vi att vi rör oss i. Så vi har fortfarande ganska tydlig negativ trend i Humble Group. Det är ingenting som har ändrats än, utan vi ser ofta att den har gjort de här rallies på positiva nyheter och rapporter tidigare för att sedan säljas av. Och vi får helt enkelt se hur det fortsätter här nu. Men för tillfället, jag ser ingenting som ser övervägande bullish ut. Utan den är fortfarande i sin negativa trend. Om jag skulle känna mig bullish i Humble Group, då hade jag velat se ett utbrott ur den här channeln. Och att vi tar oss ovanför alla moving average. Och det är ovanför 200 mig också, vilket är den gula linjen här uppe. Så kan Humble ta sig ur den här stora channeln och komma ovanför alla moving average, då tycker jag det bör se positivt ut. Och att potentiellt att vi satt en bot och det ska bli en ny längre uptrend på G, där vi då kommer jobba oss så här framöver. Lika fint som vi har fallit neråt, att vi påbörjar resan uppåt. Det kan vara lite tidiga tecken på det än, men hade vi att säga att vi bryter kanalen och stänger ovanför alla moving average för att det verkligen ska kännas bullish i bolaget. För tillfället så är det mer reaktion på rapporten och kan bli tufft här i kanaltaket. Nu ska se vilka mer har vi. Saab kan vi kolla på. Har Saab brutit ner? Det var lite jag kollade på. Det har vi. Jag pratade om, var det nu söndags vi pratade om Saab? Var det inte det? Jo, jag tog upp i måndags var det ju. Tog upp den i market-updaten i måndags. Och då kollar vi på exakt det som hände här nu. Att om vi bryter stödet här nu så kan shorts vara intressanta. För vi ska nog minst ner till 540. Men potentiellt ner mot 520. Så första nivån är claimad efter vi bröt det här väldigt, väldigt tydliga stödet. Här uppe vid 565. Den nivån är bruten. Kan studsa lite här. Men jag tror ändå vi kommer jobba oss fortsatt neråt mot i alla fall 520 nivån i Saab här nu. Det tror jag. Den bryter neråt och kommer nog fortsätta ner i alla fall till den här nivån här. Skulle jag tro. Så lite mer bearish i Saab. 520 här nere. Skulle nog hålla koll på att där kan det börja studsa lite. Men ser ganska bearish ut här nu när vi bröt det här väldigt, väldigt tydliga stödet som har hållit i princip hela året hittills. Så ser ganska bearish ut för tillfället att vilja fortsätta neråt. Avanza. Låt oss kika Avanza. Avanza. Ni som har varit med i webinarsen vet att vi har följt Avanza varje onsdag i princip, eller på söndagarna. Och jag blev bullish här när vi bröt den här kanalen. Samma sak som jag kollade på Hammer Group nu. Det är väldigt intressant när vi bryter de här längre channels. Det brukar oftast leda till en bullish reaktion. Så blev bullish i Avanza här vid 220 SEK. Jag tycker det ser fortsatt positivt ut. Och jag tror att vi kommer fortsätta upp i Avanza i alla fall till 260-256 här till den linjen. Vi kan faktiskt slänga in lite Fibonacci-nivåer också. Bara för att se var de landar. Låt oss slänga in Fibonacci. De här nivåerna här. Sen vi har några intressanta nivåer att hålla utkik på. Och då kan vi se att vi har en ganska intressant nivå här vid 253-256 vid de här topparna. Så det är mycket möjligt att vi kan jobba oss upp hit mot 255-256. Men där skulle jag nog vara förberedd på att det kan bli lite tufft för priset. Och det kan då dippa lite hårdare. Så jag tycker det ser bullish ut i Avanza. Upp till 256 eller 250-260, den här zonen här. Där kan det sedan bli lite tufft för priset. Så vi kollar på DAX. Vi kan kolla på det tyska indexet. Det kan vi göra. Hur ser vårt tyska index ut? Spontant inte jätteintressant om jag ska vara ärlig. Jag tycker inte vi ser någonting jättetydligt bullish eller bearish här. Visst, den köptes upp idag. Och vi har lite stöd här vid 16 000. Vi kommer ha motstånd här vid 16,2. Vi kommer ha en nivå här. Vi kommer ha en nivå här uppe. Jag ser ingen tydlig riktning i DAXen överhuvudtaget. Jag kan säga lika stor chans som att vi har ett brut uppåt mot 16 300 har vi nu att falla ända ner mot 15,8. Så jag skulle vara ganska neutral här i DAX faktiskt. Och skulle med jobbat mellan de olika nivåerna. Här nere finns stöd vid 16 000. Där kan det vara lite intressanta long trades. Bryter vi 16 000. Ja, men då ligger nu sannolikheten att vi ska ner till 15,8. Och det kan då vara lite intressant för short trades. Vid 15,8 finns det bra stöd. Där kan det då dyka upp lite intresse för lite long trades. Så jag hade nog overall ganska neutral syn. Och hade med jobbat med de olika stöd- och motståndsnivåerna. Och se hur den reagerar där för lite potentiella trades. Helt enkelt. Så. Vilka ska vi mäta? Pricer AB kan vi kika på. Det är klockan 20.15. Ja, då har vi en kvart till innan det är dags för herr Powell att köra. Pricer. Jäklar vad det var ner. 41 hade vi all time high på. Jättesvårt att säga något här. Vi får zooma ut weekly. Se om vi kan få någon mer data att jobba med. Vi har lows nere vid 4,5. Vad har vi mer? Vi har vi lowen där. Vi kommer ha lite motstånd där. Nej, alltså spontant ser jag inget jätteintressant i den här aktien. Visst, den har studsat lite nu, men inga jättetydliga nivåer. Kan den återhämta sig till 10? Absolut. Kan den falla rakt ner till 6 igen? Ja, det kan den. Lite positivitet kortsiktigt att 20 mig bör korsa 50 mig. Men spontant känner jag mig ganska neutral här. Den kan gå åt båda hållen. Så jag har ingen direkt syn på den här överhuvudtaget. Power cell. Vi ska se. Powell har en ganska tydlig trend här. Den hoppar ut ur den ibland, men generellt sett har den hållit ganska bra ända sedan 2020 faktiskt. Väldigt tydlig channel. Det är inte ofta vi håller dem så här länge faktiskt. Från 2020, den har gått utanför en gång, 2 gånger nu precis. Men en väldigt tydlig channel. Den har jobbat in sig i den nu igen. Så jag tror mycket möjligt att det finns chans att vi ska jobba upp till mitten på channeln i alla fall. Att vi ska upp i alla fall till mitten, upp hit. Sen här kan det bli lite tufft för priset. Möjligtvis att vi börjar dippa lite här och kanske testa någonting i den här stilen. Men just nu inne i sin channel igen. Kan absolut bli så att det blir lite dragkraft att den vill ta sig till mitten av den här kanalen här nu. Det tror jag är mycket möjligt. Och börjar visa lite positiva tecken. Men som sagt, den trendar ändå i det stora neråt. Men kortsiktigt kan det finnas lite till uppsida upp mot här i mitten. Sen finns det lite moving average här som kan bli motstånd och i mitten på kanalen helt enkelt. Vad har vi mer? Vi kan ta SSAB. Den pratade vi om i måndags också. Då pratade vi om att det var lite intressant att potentiellt ta lite long trades vid 60 nivån. Och att vi skulle upp och testa 65. Det har vi gjort där nu. Så skulle spontant inte ta någon trade här längre. Det fanns en ganska bra lång här vid 60 nivån. Ganska intressant nivå. Men här nu, svårt att säga. Vi har studsat upp här nu. Helt 50-50. Vi kan lika bra testa 60 igen. Likadant som att vi kan bryta uppåt över också. Så SSAB ganska svårt att säga här nu. Vid första touchen av 60 var lite intressant för longs. Går vi ner och testar en andra gång nu, då ökar chansen att vi ska bryta neråt allt mer. Och skulle vi bryta 60 nivån i SSAB, då ska vi nog minst ner till i alla fall 57. Vi har ett litet gap här som ni kan säga så mycket väl kan fyllas. Potentiellt även ner mot 55 och kanske ett bear case på 50. Så faller hårt på sin earnings, vilket absolut kan drabba den framöver här nu. Så 60-nivån är ett bra stöd. Håller inte den nivån så kan det börja ta allt mer fart neråt. SBB säger flera dyka in med. Låt oss kika SBB. Pratade om den i måndags. Det har inte hänt jättemycket sen i måndags tycker jag. Spontant ser inte detta jättepositivt ut. Det gör det inte. Efter det här med Brookfield-dealen inte gick igenom så ser det tekniska allt mer bearish ut. Men grejen med SBB det är att det svänger så snabbt. SBB kan imorgon gå ut och säga att de säljer en fastighet för 200 miljoner och så är vi uppe på 6,6 igen. Så det tekniska i SBB här, jag gillar det och jag använder det. Men man måste ändå väga in att SBB är väldigt nyhetsdriven just nu. Väldigt nyhetsdriven. Det är mycket som händer. Det är mycket nyheter som kan ändra från dag till dag. Så man måste hela tiden uppdatera sig med det tekniska varje dag helt enkelt. Speciellt i SBB då det är så pass mycket som händer. Det tekniska här nu ser faktiskt bearish ut. Vi är under de här moving average. Det är inte positivt. Vi hade behövt reclaima ovanför dem igen för att det ska bli positivt. Så är det extremt bearish? Nej, det är det inte. Det är inte extremt bearish. Det är det inte. Men det är nog, jag tycker det ser mer bearish ut än positivt här kortsiktigt. Så vi får se vad som händer. Men som sagt, väldigt nyhetsdriven. Går SB ut och säljer en bostad imorgon för 100 miljoner, 200 miljoner. Ja, men då kanske vi sticker rakt upp. Eller vad som helst. Så kortsiktigt ser lite bearish ut. Men som sagt, man får hålla noga koll på alla nyheter och liknande. Det måste man. Vilka mer hade vi? BHG har jag sett komma in några gånger. Låt oss kika BHG. Jag har tryckt på bra den senaste tiden. Det var nog inte länge sedan vi pratade om denna. Var det förra veckan kanske? Usch. Den är nere väldigt mycket. Och vad ska vi säga? Det är svårt att säga något jättetydligt här. Det börjar se bullish ut, det vill jag dock säga. Jag tar bort alla tidigare. Det börjar se allt mer bullish ut. För ni ser den här regnbågen här, alla våra moving average. Vi har för första gången sedan de här all time high nivåerna i 2021 kommit över alla moving average. Och det är ett väldigt hälsosamt tecken på att vi är i en uptrend och kommer fortsätta uppåt. Kortsiktigt här nu, den kan dippa ner till 15, den kan trycka på upp mot 22. Det är jättesvårt att säga. Men på medellång sikt, om vi kollar veckor och månader, så börjar det här se positivt ut att vi har en potentiell ny uptrend på gång. Och att den kommer bara fortsätta jobba sig uppåt. Vi är uppe ovanför alla moving average. Det här ser ganska positivt ut. Så ja, jag tycker det här ser ganska positivt ut. Som sagt, kortsiktigt kan vi dippa ner eller trycka på. På medellång sikt tycker jag det ser bullish ut. En ny uptrend är på G. Och det är helt enkelt bara att hålla koll på lite tidigare motståndsnivåer. Vi har en topp här vid 22, vi har en topp här vid 25. Skulle vi bryta över 25 så är det ganska fritt upp till den här zonen här uppe vid 35 till 40. Så kan den bryta 25-nivån i framtiden så är det väldigt fritt upp nästan ända till 40. Så det kan vara intressant att hålla utkik på om man då investerar eller tradar på lite längre siktor, om man swing tradar veckor och månader. Så ja, nej, men jag tycker det ser övervägande bullish ut här. Nu ska vi se. Nu ska vi se. 13. De hade väl rapport. Hade de en rapport idag? Jag tror det. Hade de inte det? Jo, jag är ganska säker på att 13 hade sin rapport idag. Hände ju inte jättemycket på den rapporten, verkade det som. Eller var det imorgon som hade rapport? När hade de rapporten? Nu måste vi kolla. 13. Jo, onsdag idag. Tänkte det. Ganska neutralt. Det är väl ingenting som vi ser jättestarkt bullish eller bearish ut här. Bullflaggar lite, men det här kan fortsätta neråt hur länge som helst. Jag har nu haft kikat på 13. 13 kanske låter helt fel, men någonting i den här stilen. Kan den bryta den här övre trendtaket? ja, men då tar vi nu target på 240 och potentiellt även jobba oss högre uppåt. Finns en hel del motstånd här vid 240 som kan bli tufft. Skulle vi kunna bryta 240, då kan den börja resa mot 260. Så 13 här nu är inne i en liten av en bullflag, så kommer röra sig så här tills vi antingen bryter neråt eller uppåt. Generellt sett så brukar jag bryta uppåt förr eller senare, och när vi väl gör det så skulle jag ha koll på att vi nu ska upp och retesta 240 nivån. Hur gick Goggin Challenge? Det gick bra, ska jag väl säga. Jag klarade, jag överlevde, men det var det värsta jag gjort i hela mitt liv. Jag har sprungit 1 mil i mitt liv kanske 6-7 gånger, och nu sprang jag 2 maraton och 8,4 mil i helgen. Jag har aldrig haft mer ont i min kropp, min knä och ben någonsin. Men vi sitter här och spelar in market update video nu, och vi lever. Jag har faktiskt gymmat idag för första gången. Det blev lite gym och bastu innan idag. Så rehabba lite nu, men börjar komma igång. Så det gick bra, men fy fan vad tufft det var. Men vi har spelat in det, så det kommer komma ut en video på det nu inom någon vecka. Så det ska bli intressant. Vi hinner någon, kanske 1-2 till innan Powell ska dra igång här. Så vilket kan vara mest intressant. Är någon som har skrivit mer än en gång? Vi kan ta Apple har ju skrivit. Jag tror inte Apple är jätteintressant. Nej. Apple, jag tycker inte det här är jätteintressant. Den kan bara fortsätta squeeza på uppåt och dippa ner när som helst. Det är möjligt att vi kommer dippa väldigt, väldigt hårt på earnings. Om earnings inte kommer in väldigt bra, då kan det vara en catalyst som sänker Apple. Men här nu tycker jag inte är jätteintressant, det gör jag inte. M8G, vi kan stänga ett snabbt öga på M8G innan Powell drar igång. Och jag har kvar samma syn som jag haft de senaste 2 veckorna. Jag var ju bullish här nere, vi kallar ju det ganska bra. Här nu, så som sagt, jag tror vi bara kommer röra oss i sidled mellan 13 och 16 ända fram till earnings, som då blir slutet på augusti. Mellan 13 till 16 här tror jag bara vi kommer gå i sidled. Och sen när earnings kommer väl det som antingen får den rasa rakt ner eller sticka på uppåt väldigt, väldigt kraftigt. Så här fram mot earnings så tror jag bara att vi kommer se väldigt, väldigt choppy prismönster. Att vi bara går här i sidled. Kanske kan finnas lite snabba tradingmöjligheter för den som är intresserad av det. Men för något större move, då tror jag att vi behöver se vad earnings har att erbjuda om då ungefär en månad. Helt enkelt. Då ska vi se. TSM, Taiwan Semiconductors, de följer på sin rapport. Vet jag, föll 5% på sin rapport. Här kan också se, vi har pratat mycket channels idag, men vad som händer när en channel bryts, väldigt tydligt. Vi går ut, vi retestar och sen tar den fart uppåt. Väldigt bra att jobba med channels när man har de här tydliga bottnarna och topparna. För när det väl bryts åt något håll brukar det bli en kraftig rörelse. Taiwan Semiconductors här. Svårt att säga. Vi kommer ha lite stöd här vid 96. Om jag hade velat trada Taiwan Semiconductors, då hade jag velat plocka upp den här vid 90. Vi har ett stort gap här som kan behöva stängas. Mycket likviditet att hämta. Kan Taiwan Semiconductors falla ner till 90, samtidigt som kanske 200 MA möter upp här, då kan jag verkligen gilla en long trade. Här uppe nu, väldigt choppy, svårt att säga. Kan det komma ner till 90, ja, men då kan jag tänka mig faktiskt ta en long trade själv också. Men fram tills dess så är det ganska 50-50. Nu ska vi se här, nu drar Powell igång om 15 sekunder. Jag måste bara ta upp den här så att vi har koll på Powell. Ibland är han sen och ibland är han tidig. Jag fick en fråga här också. Vad skulle Powell säga som får indexet att gå upp? Om Powell säger att vi börjar kolla inflationen ser ut att gå neråt och vi börjar kolla allt mer kanske på att sänka räntorna tidigare än vad vi har trott. Ja, men då kan marknaden sticka väldigt positivt på det. Neråt, den kan gå neråt på i princip allting. Det kan den. Så neråt, det är om de säger att ja, vi kommer fortsätta höja fler gånger än vad vi tidigare har trott. Men inflationssiffrorna har kommit in ganska bra. De har varit ganska låga. Så jag tror ändå att Powell kommer att prata om att inflationen är hög, men det ser bättre och bättre ut. Det vi gör fungerar. Vi kommer börja sänka räntorna nästa år. Det kommer bli en del volatilitet idag, men dagens Fed förväntar jag mig inte lika mycket volla som vissa av de andra. För jag tror inte det finns jättemycket som man kan säga att chocka idag. Så vi ska se här nu. Jag tror han ska han går in nu. Nu ska vi se. Nu går han in. Nu ska vi se. Pappa. Vi ska se här.
Pausing, and we remain strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. Without price stability, the economy doesn't work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Since early last year, the FOMC
has significantly tightened the stance of monetary policy. Today, we took another step by raising our policy interest rate a 1/4 percentage point, and we are continuing to reduce our securities holdings at a brisk pace. We've covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our tightening have yet to be felt. Looking ahead, we will continue to take a data-dependent approach in determining the extent of additional policy firming that may be appropriate. I'll have more to say about monetary policy after briefly reviewing economic developments. Recent indicators suggest that economic activity has been expanding at a moderate pace. Growth in consumer spending appears to have slowed from earlier in the year. Although activity in the housing sector has picked up somewhat, it remains well below levels of a year ago, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. And higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. The labor market remains very tight. Over the past 3 months, job gains averaged 244,000 jobs per month, a pace below that seen earlier in the year, but still a strong pace. The unemployment rate remains low at 3.6%. There are some continuing signs that supply and demand in the labor market are coming into better balance. The labor force participation rate has moved up since last year, particularly for individuals aged 25 to 54 years. Nominal wage growth has shown some signs of easing, and job vacancies have declined so far this year. While the jobs to workers gap has narrowed, labor demand still substantially exceeds the supply of available workers. Inflation remains well above our longer run goal of 2%. Over the 12 months ending in May, total PCE prices rose 3.8%. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 4.6%. In June, the 12-month change in the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, came in at 3.0%, and the change in the core CPI was 4.8%. Inflation has moderated somewhat since the middle of last year. Nonetheless, the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher cost of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We're highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning to inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 1/4 percentage point, bringing the target range to 5.25% to 5.5%. We are also continuing the process of significantly reducing our securities holdings. With today's action, we've raised our policy rate by 5.25 percentage points since early last year. We have been seeing the effects of our policy tightening on demand in the most interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy, particularly housing and investment. It will take time, however, for the full effects of our ongoing monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In addition, the economy is facing headwinds from tighter credit conditions for households and businesses, which are likely to weigh on economic activity, hiring, and inflation. In determining the extent of additional policy firming that may be appropriate to return inflation to 2% over time, the committee will take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy, the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, and economic and financial developments. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting based on the totality of the incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation, as well as the balance of risks. We remain committed to bringing inflation back to our 2% goal and to keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Steve.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. You have, I think, a couple times in your opening remarks talked about this language in determining the extent of additional policy firming that may be appropriate. Should we take that to mean that additional hikes are likely on the way? And should we also believe that all future meetings, say September and November, are live, or are you in a every other meeting mode? Thank you.
So we haven't made a decision to go to every other meeting. It's not something we've looked at. We're going to be going meeting by meeting, and as we go into each meeting, we're going to be asking ourselves the same question. So we haven't made any decisions about any future meetings, including the pace at which we'd consider hiking. But we're going to be assessing the need for further tightening that may be appropriate. You read the language, to return inflation to 2% over time. I would say that the intermeeting data came in broadly in line with expectations. Economic activity remained resilient. Job creation remained strong while cooling a bit. And the June CPI report actually came in a bit better than expectations for a change. And the June CPI report, of course, was welcome, but it's only one report, 1 month's data. We hope that inflation will follow a lower path it will be consistent with the CPI reading. But we don't know that, and we're just going to need to see more data. So what are we going to be looking at? Really, it will be the whole broader picture. And starting with, we're looking for moderate growth, right? We're looking for supply and demand through the economy coming into better balance, including in particular in the labor market. We'll be looking at inflation, and we'll be asking ourselves, does this whole collection of data, do we assess it as suggesting that we need to raise rates further? And if we make that conclusion, then we will go ahead and raise rates. So that's how we're thinking about the next meeting, and how we're thinking about meetings going forward potentially. But we're now mainly thinking about the next meeting. I will also say, since we're talking about it, between now and the September meeting, we get 2 more job reports, 2 more CPI reports. I think we have an ECI report coming later this week, which is Employment Compensation Index. And lots of data on economic activity. All of that information is going to inform our decision as we go into that meeting. I would say it is certainly possible that we would raise funds again at the September meeting if the data warranted. And I would also say it's possible that we would choose to hold steady at that meeting. We're going to be making careful assessments, as I said, meeting by meeting. And I'll close by saying we've raised the federal funds rate now by 525 basis points since March 2022. Monetary policy, we believe, is restrictive and is putting downward pressure on economic activity and inflation.
If I could just briefly follow up on something you said there. You said the data in the intermediate period, it broadly came in line with expectations. Does that mean there's unlikely to have been a change in the overwhelming outlook of the committee that 2 more hikes are necessary?
I'm just going to go back to what I said. That's the question. We have 8 weeks now until the September meeting, and all that data that I recited, we're going to be looking at all of that and making that assessment then. And it really, we did have the one good reading, and of course we welcome that, but it's just one reading, as everybody knows. And we've seen this before in the data. Many forecasts call for rates for inflation to remain low, but we just don't know that until we see the data. So we'll be focusing on that.
Gina. Thank you. Thanks for taking our questions, Chair Powell. Obviously, you upgraded the language around growth in the statement today. We've seen the Barbie movie numbers. We've seen everyone going to Taylor Swift concerts this summer. It seems like the American consumer is in pretty good shape. And it does seem like growth is sort of picking back up a little bit, or at least doing well. And I wonder, from your perspective, if that continues, if we see growth not just stabilizing, but performing well this summer, is that a problem because it's inflationary, or is it good news because it suggests that a soft landing is more likely? Just how are you thinking about that sort of trajectory?
Yeah, so I would say it this way. The overall resilience of the economy, the fact that we've been able to achieve disinflation so far without any meaningful negative impact on the labor market, the strength of the economy, overall, that's a good thing. It's good to see that, of course. It's also, you see consumer confidence coming up and things like that. That will support activity going forward. But you're right, though. At the margin, stronger growth could lead over time to higher inflation, and that would require an appropriate response from monetary policy. So we'll be watching that carefully and seeing how it evolves over time.
Neil.
Thanks, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin from Axios. So as you referenced earlier, in the intermeeting period, soft CPI, jobs reports, still strong but moderating, JOLTS look good. So if you're data dependent, why not pause again? Why not stay on hold? Why not take another meeting off when the data was at least cutting in the direction you want to see?
So if you go back to what we're trying to do here, we're trying to achieve a stance of policy that's sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2%. At the last meeting, we wrote down our individual estimates of what that would take, and the median of that was an additional 2 rate hikes. So I would say we looked at the intermeeting data, and as I mentioned, broadly consistent, not perfectly consistent, but broadly consistent with expectations, and as a result, we went ahead and took another step. And that's a labor market that continues to be strong, but gradually slowing. I mentioned that the inflation report was actually a little better than expected, but we're going to be careful about taking too much signal from a single reading. And growth came in stronger than expected. So that's how we look at it, and so we did take that step today.
Nick Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, markets widely believe the median FOMC participants' inflation forecast from June for the fourth quarter of this year will be too high, given autos and shelter, and that by September that may warrant a downward revision in the inflation forecast of 20 to 30 basis points. Would that type of inflation progress be enough to hold rates steady from here, or do you need to see below-trend growth and decelerating labor income growth to be convinced that you've done enough?
So it's hard to pick the pieces apart and say, how much of this and how much of that. We'll be looking at everything. And, of course, we'll be looking to see whether the signal from June CPI is replicated or the opposite of replicated, or whether it's somewhere in the middle. We'll be looking at the growth data. We'll be looking at the labor market data very closely, of course, and making an overall judgment about that. It's the totality of the data, I think, but with a particular focus on making progress on inflation.
If I could follow up, last month you said there were benefits to moderating the pace of increases because it would give you more information to make decisions. Would another CPI report like the one we just had in June allow you to at least maintain that slower pace and defer until the fall any decision on whether you need that second rate hike?
So I'm just going to tell you again what we're going to do in September. We're going to look at 2 additional job reports, 2 additional CPI reports, lots of activity data. And that's what we're going to look at, and we're going to make that decision then. And that decision could mean another hike in September, or it could mean that we decide to maintain at that level. And again, the question we're going to be asking ourselves is, Is the overall signal one that we need to do more, that we need to tighten further? And if we get that signal whenever we get it, then, and that's the collective judgment of the committee, then we will move ahead. If we don't, you know, then we'll have the option of maintaining policy at that level. But it's really dependent so much on the data, and we just don't have it yet.
Chris.
Hi, Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. So consumer confidence in the economy is rising, likely in large part because of the declines in headline inflation. You also see wages are also rising faster than prices now after trailing them for a long time. How much are Americans truly harmed by inflation at its current level, headline level of 3%? And with that in mind, when do you put some weight back on the employment side of the dual mandate?
So I guess I'd say it this way. First, it is a good thing that headline inflation has come down so much, because that's really what the public experiences. And I would say that having headline inflation move down that much almost creates it will strengthen the broad sense that the public has that inflation is coming down, which will in turn, we hope, help inflation continue to move down. So you were really, sorry, what your question was?
Well, I mean, you've talked for many press conferences now about the harm created by inflation, how hard it is for people. So how much of that are we still seeing with inflation now down at 3?
So I guess I would put it this way. I'd say it this way. It's really a question of how do you balance the two risks, the risk of doing too much or doing too little. And, you know, I would say that, you know, we're coming to a place where there really are risks on both sides. It's hard to say exactly whether they're in balance or not, but as our stances become more restrictive and inflation moderates, we do increasingly face that risk. But you know, we need to see that inflation is durably down that far. You know, as you know, we think, and most economists think, that core inflation is actually a better signal of where headline inflation is going, because headline inflation is affected greatly by volatile energy and food prices. So we would want core inflation to be coming down, because that's what we think, core is signaling where headline's going to go in the future. And core inflation is still pretty elevated. You know, there's reason to think it can come down now, but it's still quite elevated. And so we think we need to stay on task, and we think we're going to need to certainly hold policy at a restricted levels for some time, and we need to be prepared to raise further if we think that's appropriate.
Well, and then if inflation were to, just a quick follow, if it stays at 3 or drops even a little bit more, I mean, how much of an increase in unemployment do you think is acceptable to get that last bit of inflation? People are talking about the potential difficulty of the so-called last mile of inflation. So, but how much unemployment do you think is justified to get down that last? So it
is a very positive thing that actually the unemployment rate is the same as it was when we lifted off in March of 22 at 3.6%. So that's a real blessing, and that we've been able to achieve some disinflation. And we don't seek to, it's not that we're aiming to raise unemployment, but I would just say the historical record, we have to be honest about the historical record, which does suggest that when central banks go in and slow the economy to bring down inflation, the result tends to be some softening in labor market conditions. And so that is still the likely outcome here. And, you know, we hope that that's as little as possible. We have to be honest that is the likely outcome. The worst outcome for everyone, of course, would be not to deal with inflation now, not get it done. Whatever the short-term social costs of getting inflation under control, the longer-term social costs of failing to do so are greater, and that the historical record is very, very clear on that. If you go through a period where inflation expectations are not anchored, inflation is volatile, it interferes with people's lives and with economic activity, and you know that's the thing we really need to avoid and will avoid.
Michael McKee.
At this point, you say the policy is restrictive, but all year long we have seen growth surprise to the upside, unemployment to the downside, and inflation lately to the downside. So I'm wondering, by definition, should you be restrictive enough right now under these conditions? Do you think you might need to do more? Because I'm curious about what you see as inflation dynamics now? Is the economy still moving in a direction where it creates more inflation? People talk about base effects and higher energy costs, and now we have some large labor settlements. Or is the economy disinflating, and you're able to go back to the old Fed policy of opportunistic disinflation?
So I'll just say, again, the broader picture of what we want to see is we want to see easing of supply constraints and normalization of pandemic-related distortions to demand and supply. We want to see economic growth running at moderate or modest levels to help ease inflationary pressures. We want to see continued restoration of supply and demand balance, particularly in the labor market, and all of that should lead to declining inflationary pressures. Now, what we see is we see those pieces of the puzzle coming together, and we're seeing evidence of those things now. But I would say that what our eyes are telling us is that policy has not been restrictive enough for long enough to have its full desired effects. So we intend, again, to keep policy restrictive until we're confident that inflation is coming down sustainably toward our 2% target, and we're prepared to further tighten if that is appropriate. And we think the process, still probably has a long way to go.
Well, do you think under current conditions you are restrictive enough unless something changes?
Well, I think we think today's rate hike was appropriate, and I think we're going to be looking at the incoming data to inform our decision at the next meeting about is the incoming data telling us that we need to do more, and if it does tell us that collectively, if that's our view, then we will do more.
Colby.
Thank you. Colby Smith with the Financial Times. If September is in fact a live meeting, how does that square with the need for a more gradual tightening pace that you spoke of last month in explaining the rationale for holding the funds rate steady at the June meeting?
So a more gradual pace doesn't go immediately to every other meeting. It could be 2 out of 3 meetings, right? It just means if you're slowing down. The point really was to slow down the decision cycle as we get closer and closer to, we think, our destination. And I wouldn't want to go automatically to every other meeting because I just don't think that's, I think it's not an environment where we want to provide a lot of forward guidance. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. We just want to keep moving at what we think is the right pace. And I do think it makes all the sense in the world to slow down as we now make these finally judged decisions. And so that's what we did. And so I think it's possible, I mentioned before, it's possible that we would move at consecutive meetings. We're not taking that off the table, or we might not. It's really going to depend on what the data tell us. That's the best we can do.
So we shouldn't assume that every other meeting is the lowest tightening frequency, let's say. It could be, longer intervals in between as well.
I think we're going to look. I think we're going to make a decision about the next meeting, and then we're going to make a decision about the one after that. And I think it'll sort itself out.
Thanks. Howard Schneider with Reuters. Among your colleagues, there have been people who've said they feel that very little transmission has taken place so far from monetary policy into the economy, and there are those who feel, they say, it's happened very fast this time and it's kind of up to date. Where are you on that continuum?
So there's a long-running debate about the lags between changes in financial conditions and the response to those changes from economic activity and inflation, right? So we know that in the modern era, financial conditions move in anticipation of our decisions, and that has clearly been the case in this cycle. So in a sense, the clock starts earlier than it used to, but that doesn't necessarily change the process from that point on, and it's not clear that it has. I'll tell you what we know and then what we don't know. We know that financial conditions affect economic activity and inflation with a lag that can be long and variable, or lags, plural, that can be long and variable. A lot of uncertainty around the length of the lags, and by the way, that's just one component of the broader uncertainty that we face. So I'll tell you how I think about this. The first thing to say is we're determined to bring inflation down to 2% over time, and we will use our tools to do that. No one should doubt that. I would look at it this way, though. The real federal funds rate is now in meaningfully positive territory. If you take the nominal federal funds rate, subtract a mainstream estimate of near-term inflation expectations, you get a real federal funds rate that is well above most estimates of the longer-term neutral rate. So I would say monetary policy is restrictive, more so after today's decision, meaning that it is putting downward pressure on economic activity and inflation. We'll keep monetary policy restrictive until we think it's not appropriate to do so. So that's how I think about it. I mean, if I sum it up, I would say we've come a long way. We are resolutely committed to returning inflation to our 2% goal over time. Inflation has proved, repeatedly, has proved stronger than we and other forecasters have expected. And at some point that may change. We have to be ready to follow the data. And given how far we've come, we can afford to be a little patient as well as resolute as we let this unfold.
On the credit side, I'm wondering if you saw anything in the latest SLOOS data that made you think you're getting a quantum of credit contraction beyond what you'd expect. The bank lending data really is, the growth rates edging down towards and below, heading below zero, which is usually a recession indicator.
So I guess the SLOOS will come out early next week, and I would just say it's broadly consistent with what you would expect. You've got lending conditions tight and getting a little tighter. You've got weak demand, and it gives a picture of pretty tight credit conditions in the economy. I think it's really hard to tease out how much of that is from this source or that source, but I think what matters is the overall picture is of tight and tightening lending conditions, and that's what this SLOOS will say.
Rachel. Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thanks for taking our questions. Could you break down the reasons why inflation has fallen and what share of that credit you would give to factors that don't stem directly from rate hikes or that might be within your control at all, like easing supply chains and a drop in energy prices over the past year?
Yeah. So, interesting question. So, let me start by saying that the inflation surge that we saw in the pandemic resulted from a collision of elevated demand and constrained supply, both of which followed from the unprecedented features of the pandemic and the response from fiscal and monetary policy. And we've always expected that the disinflationary process would stem from both from the normalization of those broad pandemic-related supply and demand conditions and from restrictive monetary policy, which would help return the balance between supply and demand by restraining demand. And we think that's broadly what we're seeing. So to go break it down a little further, of course, headline inflation has come down sharply from elevated levels as energy and food prices have come down, mostly due to reversal of the effects from the war in Ukraine. And that's a good thing, and the public experiences that, as I mentioned earlier. For core inflation, I'd say there has been a role for both factors, that I mentioned. Clearly, for goods, normalization of supply conditions is playing an important role, as is the beginning of the reversal of spending back into services and away from goods. And take autos as an example. The combination of an increase in sales and inventories, while vehicle inflation has decelerated, points to a substantial role for supply. But there's also a role for demand, as the loans and things like that are more expensive. So they're both working there. Housing services inflation now starts to move down. Clearly, higher rates have slowed the housing market. I would say monetary policy is working about as we expect, and we think it'll play an important role going forward, in particular in non-housing services, where really we think that's where the labor market will come in as a very, very important factor. So we think both of those sources of disinflation are playing an important role.
I see. And just to follow up, do you think that of those two sources, that core will rely more heavily on seeing an impact from rate hikes, or is there a more even split there too?
I think monetary policy is going to be important going forward, because we're sort of reaping now the benefits of the reversal of some of the very specific pandemic things. We're seeing that with goods in particular, with supply chains and shortages moving, and we're seeing. So I think going forward, monetary policy will be important, particularly in the sector, in the non-housing services sector.
Edward.
Thank you, Chair Powell. First, let me compliment your tie, the choice of tie. So thanks for taking our question. So the Beige Book, it said, input cost pressures remain elevated for services firms, but eased notably for manufacturing sector. Is that an indication that there's a wage inflation pressure? And how do you target and pressure on the wage inflation without pushing the economy into recession?
Well, I think as it relates to goods, it's really an indication that supply chains and shortages are easing. And so what was the first part of it?
So wage inflation, like how do you target wage inflation without pushing an economy into a recession?
I don't think we're targeting wage inflation. I think what we're looking for is a broad cooling in labor market conditions, and that's what we're seeing. So wages have actually been gradually moving down. They're still at levels that would be consistent over a long period of time with 2% inflation. Nonetheless, we're making progress there, and by so many indicators, labor market demand is cooling. You can look at surveys by workers and businesses who see that. You can look at the quits rate normalizing. You can look at job openings coming down. You can look at just job creation in the establishment survey has, it's still at a high level, but it was at really an extraordinarily high level for most of the last 2 years. So you see cooling, particularly in private sector in the last, in the last report. So I think we see that, and it's happening at a gradual pace. So that's actually not a bad thing in a sense, because if what we see is a labor market, very strong demand for labor, which is really the engine of the economy. People are getting hired, many people going back to work, getting wages, spending money, and that's really what's driving the economy. But that it's gradually slowing, it's gradually cooling. That's a good prescription for getting where we want to get.
But still, we see a push to raise minimum wage. We're seeing a lot of unions go on strike or threaten strike, and the common thing is they come out with agreements like big pay increases, like UPS, and we have the auto workers coming up. Are you concerned then about a trend of series of big unions, these contract pushing wage inflation then?
Not for us to comment on contract negotiations. Not our job, not our role. We monitor these things and we'll keep an eye on them. But really, that's something that's handled at that level. And not
a large amount.
Victoria.
Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. I wanted to ask about the SEP, which suggests that you would cut rates as overall and core PCE get to around or under 3%. And so I'm wondering, is the level of inflation what's sort of important there as you think about getting to 2% and when you might start cutting rates, or is the speed at which inflation is falling also important?
I think you'd take both into account. I think you'd take everything into account when you start cutting rates. It would depend on the whole, on a wide range of things. And when people are writing down rate cuts next year, it just is a sense that inflation is coming down and we're comfortable that it's coming down and it's time to start cutting rates. I think, but I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty between what happens, in the next meeting cycle, let alone the next year, let alone the year after that. So it's hard to say exactly what happens there, what's motivating people.
So if it's sort of stubbornly in maybe the high 2s, you wouldn't necessarily cut rates?
I'm not saying that at all. I'm not giving you any numerical guidance around that. I'm saying we'd be comfortable cutting rates when we're comfortable cutting rates, and that won't be this year, I don't think. It would be, many people wrote down rate cuts for next year. I think the median was several for next year, and that's just going to be a judgment that we have to make then, a full year from now, and it'll be about how confident we are that inflation is in fact coming down to our 2% goal.
Steve.
A good part of Wall Street has become more confident that the Fed is going to be able to engineer a soft landing, and they've reduced their forecast for a recession. And I'm wondering if the staff has changed its view on the likelihood of a recession being likely, and if you personally have changed your view in terms of becoming more confident that you can achieve a soft landing.
So it has been my view consistently that we do have a shot, and my base case is that we will be able to achieve inflation moving back down to our target without the kind of really significant downturn that results in high levels of job losses that we've seen in some past instances, many past instances of tightening that look like ours. That's been my view. That's still my view, and I think that's sort of consistent with what I see today. So, but it's a long way from assured, and we have a lot left to go to see that happen. So the staff now has a noticeable slowdown in growth starting later this year in the forecast, but given the resilience of the economy recently, they are no longer forecasting a recession. I just want to note that that our staff produces its own forecast, which is independent of the forecast that we, as FOMC participants, produce. Having an independent staff forecast, as well as the individual participant forecast, is really a strength of our process. There's just a lot of, I think, constructive diversity of opinion that helps us make, informs our deliberations, helps us make, I hope, better decisions.
And is the reason for optimism that inflation has come down and you still have a strong labor market? I mean, does that add to the optimism?
I wouldn't use the term optimism about this yet. I would say, though, that there's a pathway, and yes, that's a good way to think about it. We've seen so far the beginnings of disinflation without any real costs in the labor market, and that's a really good thing. I would just also say the historical record suggests that there's very likely to be some softening in labor market conditions. And consistent with having a soft landing, you would have some softening in labor market conditions, and that's still likely as we go forward with this process. But it's a good thing to date that we haven't really seen that. We've seen softening through not through unemployment, not through higher unemployment. We've seen softening through job openings coming down part of the way back to more normal levels. The quits rate, so people are not quitting as much. We've seen participation, people coming in, and so labor supply has improved, which has lowered the temperature in the labor market, which was quite overheated, going back a year or so. So we're seeing that kind of cooling, and that's very healthy, and we hope it continues.
Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jeff Cox from CNBC.com. You and other Fed officials in the past have suggested that you don't need to keep hiking until inflation hits 2%, that as long as you see continued progress. So I'm wondering, how close do you need to get with the inflation numbers coming down? How many months of data do you need to see that will give you sufficient confidence? And how far does this fight need to go before you're willing to kind of declare victory on it?
So the idea that we would keep hiking until inflation gets to 2%, it would be a prescription of going way past the target. That's clearly not the appropriate way to think about it. So. In effect, if you look at our forecasts, the median participant, and again, these are forecasting out years, so take them with a grain of salt, but people are cutting rates next year because the federal funds rate is at a restrictive level now. So if we see inflation coming down credibly, sustainably, then we don't need to be at a restrictive level anymore. We can move back to a neutral level, and then below a neutral level at a certain point. I think we of course would be very careful about that. We'd really want to be sure that inflation is coming down in a sustainable level. And it's hard to make, I'm not going to try to make a numerical assessment of when and where that would be, but that's the way I would think about it, is you'd stop raising long before you got to 2% inflation, and you'd start cutting before you got to 2% inflation too, because we don't see ourselves getting to 2% inflation until, all the way back to 2 until 2025 or so. So.
Jennifer.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. It's been over 4 months since a handful of regional banks, including Silicon Valley Bank, failed. When you look at credit conditions now, given Bank of California's acquisition of PacWest, does this acquisition suggest the full impact has not been felt, or are you comfortable saying that we've seen most of the ripple effects that may have occurred at this point, and how does this play into your outlook for policy?
So I don't want to comment on any particular merger proposal, but I will say things have settled down for sure out there. Deposit flows have stabilized, capital and liquidity remain strong, aggregate bank lending was stable quarter over quarter and is up significantly year over year. Banking sector profits generally are coming in strong this quarter, and overall the banking system remains strong and resilient. Of course, we're still watching the situation carefully and monitoring conditions in the banking sector. In terms of the the actual effect on, if you think of a particular set of banks that were affected because of their size and business model and things like that, that were more affected by the turmoil in March than others, it's very hard, as I mentioned, it's very hard to sort of tease out the effects on this very large economy of ours from them tightening. They may be tightening a little bit more, probably are, than other banks. The SLOOS has been telling us for more than a year that banking conditions are tightening. That process is ongoing, and that will restrain economic growth. So I think we have to take a step back from. I can't separate those anymore. I think basically we're just looking at the overall picture, which is one of tightening credit conditions, and that's going to restrain economic activity. It is restraining economic activity. So that's how I would look at it.
And how is that informing your outlook for setting policy?
So I think that is an expected result of tightening interest rate policy, is that bank credit conditions bank lending conditions would tighten as well. And so the question is it more effective this time because of what happened in May? I just don't think we know that. I think we're looking at the current data in GDP, and we're seeing strong spending, we're seeing a strong economy, and it's made us confident that we can go ahead and raise interest rates now for the third time since the March events. It seems like the economy is weathering this well, but of course we're watching it carefully and expect to continue to do that.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thanks for taking our questions. Megan Casella with Barron's. I wondered on wages if you were at all concerned about any inflationary impact of wages now outpacing inflation, which is likely contributing to the boost in consumer sentiment and the continued strength of the consumer that we've been seeing.
Well, wages in excess of inflation means real wages are positive. Again, that's a great thing. Of course, we want that. We want people to have real wages, but we want wages to be going up at a level that's consistent with 2% inflation over time. As I mentioned, nominal wages have been coming down gradually, and that's what we want to see. We expect to see more of that. That's just more of what's consistent over a longer period of time. We don't really think that wages were an important cause of inflation in the first year or so of the outbreak, but I would say that wages are probably an important issue going forward. Labor market conditions broadly are going to be an important part of getting inflation back down, and that's why we think we need some further softening in labor market conditions.
This goes sort of to the balance of risks question, but you mentioned at the start how you're keeping an eye on consumer activity and whether there might be some sort of a rebound there. And I'm curious what the Fed's explanation would be to families if further interest rate hikes start to hit the labor market, start to drive that sentiment back down. What's the message there of why you continue to keep rates elevated or to raise them?
Well, we have a job assigned to us by Congress to get inflation under control, and we think the single most important thing we can do to benefit those very families, especially families at the lower end of the income spectrum, is to get inflation sustainably under control and restore price stability. We think that is the most important thing we can do now, and we're determined to do that. And I would just point out that the people who are the most hurt by inflation right away are people who are on a low fixed income, who, when you're talking about travel or transportation costs, heating costs, clothing, food, things like that, those, if you're just making it through each month on your paycheck and prices go up, you're in trouble right away. Even middle class people have some resources and can absorb inflation. The people in the lower end of the income spectrum have a harder time doing that. So we need to get this done, and the record is clear that if we take too long or if we don't succeed, that the pain will only be greater. So that's how I would explain what we're doing.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Simon Rabinovich with The Economist. You had said last month that this meeting this week was going to be a live one. In the event, the market had assigned a roughly 99% probability to the rate move that you announced today. The decision was, of course, unanimous, and the statement was basically unchanged from last month. So may I ask, to what extent was the meeting actually a live one? Was there ever any doubt over the past 2 days about what the decision was actually going to be?
Well, I mean, you could. Was there doubt? Look, I would say there's a range of views on the committee, and when you see the minutes in 3 weeks, you'll see that. There's a range of views about what we should do at this meeting and what we should do at the next meeting, and it's a process that we go through. Many times when we go into a meeting, the decision is not, fundamentally in doubt. Nonetheless, we have the meeting, and some meetings are less uncertain than others, and I'll just leave it at that.
Evan Wright, Market News International. Thank you, Chair Powell. Financial conditions have been loosening at a fairly steady clip in recent weeks. The dollar, the stock market, etc. What does that mean for the Fed and being sure that inflation will come down to target?
So we monitor, of course, financial conditions. We're going to use our policy tools to working through financial conditions to get inflation under control. The implication is, we will do what it takes to get inflation down, and in principle, that could mean that if financial conditions get looser, we have to do more. But what tends to happen, though, is financial conditions get in and out of alignment with what we're doing, and ultimately, over time, we get where we need to go.
If I could also ask about the SEP from June that showed rate cuts. Do you expect the Fed to cut nominal rates next year while also continuing QT?
So that could happen. The question is, is that consistent with? So if you think about both of them as normalization, imagine it's a world where things are okay, and it's time to bring rates down from what are restrictive levels to more normal levels. Normalization in the case of the balance sheet would be to reduce QT. So. Or to continue it, you depending on where you are in the cycle. So they're two independent things, and really the active tool of monetary policy is rates. But you can imagine circumstances in which it would be appropriate to have them working in what might be seen to be just different ways, but that wouldn't be the case.
Let's go to Kyle.
Thanks, Chair Powell. Kyle Campbell with American Banker. I have a question about the discount window. I'm wondering if since the bank failures of the spring, if you've seen signs that banks have taken more steps to be proactive in assuring that they're ready to use that facility if they need to. And if you have any sort of thoughts on whether policies might be appropriate for making sure that banks sort of test regularly to show that they are prepared to use it. Thanks.
So that's a very important thing, yes, and yes to both sides of that. Yes, banks are now working to see that they are ready to use the discount window, and we are strongly encouraging them to do that, banks broadly. We did find, as you know, during the events of March, and that that it's a little clunkier. It can be a little clunkier and not as quick as it needs to be sometimes. So why not be in a situation where you're just much more ready in case you need to access the discount window?
Let's go to Mark.
Mr. Chairman, Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. You've talked in the past about getting the housing market back into better balance, excuse me, and also that the market might have bottomed. Where do you see that situation and balance, or lack thereof, right now, particularly with the constrained inventory of existing homes that might otherwise be coming onto market at a time when existing homeowners are reluctant to move? And of course, all of that happening with the 30-year fixed rate mortgage still around 7% on the heels of Fed tightening, and with what you're talking about, tightening industry lending standards. Are we getting closer to balance or farther away? What's your sense?
I think we've got a ways to go to get back to balance, really for the reasons that you talked about. With existing homes, there are many people who have low-rate mortgages, and whereas they might want to sell in a normal situation, they're not going to because they have so much value in their mortgage, which means that supply of existing homes is really, really tight, which is keeping prices up. On the other hand, there's a lot of supply coming online now, and there are people coming in. A lot of the buyers are first-time buyers coming in at buying it, with these relatively elevated mortgage rates. But I think this will take some time to work through. Hopefully, more supply comes online, and we work through it. We're still living through the the aftermath of the pandemic.
We'll go to Nancy for the last question.
Hi, Chair Powell. Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. Russia has pulled out of an agreement allowing shipments of grain safe passage through the Black Sea, and alternative routes at this point could be closed off. Just wondering, how could that contribute to higher food prices and inflation generally, and how closely are you watching that?
We are watching it, of course, very closely. And you're right, the withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative does raise concerns about global food security, particularly for poorer countries that import a large share of their food. Grain prices did go up on this news, but they remain well below their peaks of last spring. And the moves that we've seen so far, I would say, are not expected to make a significant contribution to U.S. inflation. Of course, we will be watching that situation carefully.
So you don't think it would have a big effect on Fed policy at this point?
You wouldn't say so looking at what we know now.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yes, då var vi klara med Powell. Vi ska säga ljudet är påstängde av det innan. Så. Yes. Ja, då var vi klara med Powell för den här gången. Inte jättemycket klarhet om jag ska vara ärlig. Han dansar mest runt ämnet tycker jag. Jag tycker väl det återspeglas i price action. Vi hade ju också, vi har gått upp, vi har gått ner och nu är vi tillbaka i princip runt där vi har gått större delen av öppningen här runt 4,70 ungefär. Så spontant inget jättestort. Vi kan se om media har snappat upp någonting. CNBC brukar skriva ganska intressanta artiklar. Fed approves hike that takes interest rates to highest level in more than 22 years. Det är inte jättenytt. Här är väl lite key points. The Federal Reserve approved a much anticipated interest rate hike that takes. Ja, det vet vi. Det vet vi också. De höjde med 0,25%. While policy makers indicated at the June meeting that 2 rate hikes are coming this year, markets are pricing in a better than even chance that there won't be any more moves this year. Så de påstår att alltså marknaden prisar in att det finns en chans att det inte blir några höjningar, medan Powell påstår att det kan vara 2 till. Så vi får se vad som händer. Jag personligen tyckte väl att han sa både inflationen är låg och det fungerar, men det är för tidigt för att börja sänka räntor. Så overall ganska neutralt möte. Det var också lite den synen som jag kände att han skulle ha när vi gick in i samtalet också. Jag trodde inte att det skulle vara något jätte speciellt riktigt. Men vi har haft en del volatilitet här nu. Zoomar vi ut i nasdaq och avrundar lite grann. Ja, nu kan låter vi som en robot. Det input capture. Nu låter vi som en robot. Ja, vi ska ändå avrunda här nu. Vi får köra sista minuten som en robot. Jag vet inte, jag pausade micken, nu kanske den laggar lite. Vi avslutar som en robot sista minuten. Det enda jag skulle säga egentligen var att för nasdaq imorgon, den här nivån här vid 350 blir väldigt intressant. Kan vi få stöd där, då kan vi absolut trycka på uppåt. Så lite long trades här nere hade varit väldigt intressant. Det är något jag kommer kika på imorgon om vi kan komma ner hit. Skulle vi se ut att stänga under de här nivåerna, då ska vi nog ända ner mot 15,1. Men kan vi komma ner till 350, 360 här, då kommer jag personligen börja kolla på intressanta long trades. Men vi får se hur nasdaq stänger, vi har en halvtimme kvar. Vi har Meta efter stängning idag. Är det någon mer tech-aktie vi har efter stängning? Meta och eBay, det kommer kunna påverka en hel del. Så det vill man hålla koll på nu idag. Annars så, om du gillar videon, likea gärna videon. Prenumerera på kanalen om du inte är prenumerant på YouTube. Prenumerera så vi kan fortsätta växa, så jag kan nå 10 000 någon gång. Och är du inte med i Discorden, gå med i den. Det kommer finnas en länk här i videon. Så annars så, tack för den här videon. Nu säger roboten hej då. Tack för att ni tunade in. Ni får ha det så bra så länge, så hörs vi. Det här var Robin Omega och jag säger ciao.